Hello, and welcome to HHH, the podcast where we talk about those horrible humans in history. I am your host, Angela Pearson, and for those of you who are just tuning in today, welcome. I hope you go back and listen to some of our previous episodes, but if you are one of my constant followers and listen every week, I am so glad you're here. I appreciate everything that you're doing. We are on episode 25. So I hope you guys are having as much fun at this as I am, because it has been a blast to read about these horrible humans. So make sure you're liking, subscribing, and sharing this with people you know that also love hearing these crazy stories about horrible people. So today we're going to jump in. We're going to talk about the first ever Tsar of Russia. And his name is Ivan the Terrible. Now, before we go any further, I must explain something that's very important. Ivan the Terrible's name isn't actually Ivan the Terrible. It was a mistranslation. It was a terrible, I get it, terrible mistranslation. His name was actually supposed to be Ivan the Formidable or Ivan the Fearsome. That's actually what it was supposed to mean. But luckily, or unluckily for him, the mistranslation actually fits him so much better because he was genuinely terrible. He was the man who built the iconic St. Basil's Cathedral and defended Moscow from the Tatar invasion. He was the hero of another horrible human in history that we have yet to talk about, but we will at some point. And his name was, drumroll, Stalin. Stalin loved this man, if that gives you an idea of where we're going with Ivan the Terrible. So he actually was as terrible as his mistranslated name makes him sound. He was awful. So it's time to dive in to our episode for the week so we can find out what made Ivan the Terrible so terrible. Ivan IV Vasilevich, better known as Ivan the Terrible, was born August 25th, 1530. Yep, we're going that far back. 1530. And the night that he was born, there was a terrible storm battering Moscow. And he was born the eldest son of Vasily III, who had actually waited 20 years to have an heir born to the throne. And he finally got sick of waiting and actually divorced his first wife and married his second wife, Elena Glinskaya, which is Ivan's mother. Now, the reason why it's important that I note that there was a terrible storm battering Moscow when Ivan was born, it's because when Ivan's dad divorced his first wife, that was a huge scandal. Huge scandal. And one religious man even said to Ivan's father that this evil act will produce an evil heir, one who will terrorize the country. Well, that religious man was not wrong. So Ivan's father, Vasilevich, thought that the storm was kind of a sign that, oh no, this man's prophecy is coming true. And it did. So let's get into this. Let's talk about Ivan's life and what led him to being so crazy awful. So when Ivan was born, Russia wasn't actually called Russia. So if you hear me talking about Muscovy, that's actually Russia. And it could be Muscovy or Muscovy. I'm not sure. I'm going to pronounce it the way I want to. And if you don't like it, that's fine. You can just move on. So it could, and if you want to be really formal, you could call it the Grand Duchy of Moscow. We're just going to call it Muscovy. Anyways, it also was not as big as Russia is now. And by not as big as it is now, I mean it was itty bitty. It was tiny. And it was landlocked. It had no access to the ocean. And that's important to note. So it was very weak and it was surrounded by enemies. The biggest enemies being Poland, Lithuania. That's one country at the time, by the way. Poland, Lithuania. It sounds like two countries. It's one. At some point, I'll just refer to it as Poland so it's less confusing. But at this point in history, they were almost a full united country, but they just kind of were allies-ish at this point. I don't know. It's confusing. It's nitty-gritty. We're going to not get into that. But anyways, the other enemy was the Khanate of Crimea. There were also a lot of smaller Islamic can't even pronounce it, Khanites, because they were left over from Genghis Khan. Remember our friend Genghis Khan? If you haven't heard that episode, a little plug for that, go listen to that. But these were the little territories left over after his rule, and they surrounded Muscovy. And they were all smaller powers, and Muscovy was so small that they didn't really have enough strength to conquer any of these smaller Islamic territories. But the most important thing to remember, because I know all of these different names and countries and things are really confusing, is that Russia, aka Muscovy, was an Orthodox Christian state that was surrounded by Islamic and Catholic countries. So not only do they have like country rivalries, but they've got religion playing into there too. And we all know how that goes in history. Not great, right? So none of this mattered at the time to Ivan because he was way too young, and his father was there to deal with all the drama between all of these states and all the rulers, and he was there to rule Muscovy. Well, I mean, at least that was the case until his father died when Ivan was only 3 years old. So he didn't really get a chance to get to know his father because his dad in 1533 actually contracted an infection that made him so weak he could not leave his bed. And so knowing that he was about to die, he actually summoned the boyars. The boyars, to clarify, was a class of warrior nobles. So they were the most influential people. Basically, they helped rule Muscovy at the time. So he summoned all the boyars to his bedside, and he made them swear that they would be loyal to Ivan. Once Ivan was old enough to take the crown, all of these boyars swore that they would allow him to take the crown and they would be loyal to him. And in the meantime, while Ivan was growing up, they swore that they would be loyal to his second wife, so Ivan's mother, Elena, who ruled in Ivan's stead until Ivan could actually take the power himself when he was older. So very soon after he was able to do this, his father did pass away. And on December 4th, 1533, Ivan was proclaimed Grand Prince of Muscovy. Again, at this point in time, he is 3 years old. So he is very, very young. And from that point on, Ivan was always surrounded by armed guards to protect him from the boyars because his mother was terrified that they would try and kill him because he was this small kid who was a threat to their power. Well, it turns out she actually did not need to worry about them murdering Ivan. He was totally safe. She should have been worrying about herself. The boyars came up with a different plan, and instead of actually killing the small child, because, that would be terrible, killing a kid, why not just kill his mother and take her place as the heir? And that is exactly what they did. So his mother died on April 4th, 1538, after being assassinated by the Boyars. And this devastated Ivan. This will play a part later in his life. And shockingly, but not shockingly, her death would set off an intense power struggle in the Muscovite court. So there's basically a power vacuum. So all of these Boyars started fighting over who should have the power at this point. And poor little Ivan got swept up in the middle of this chaos, meaning most of his childhood was spent surrounded by cruelty, intrigue, political uproar, like all of it. And he was in the very middle. So, for example, these Boyars, they did anything to keep their power. So at one point, Ivan actually witnessed one of his mentors who had crossed one of the Boyars being skinned alive because he dared to cross that powerful family. This is the kind of environment that Ivan grew up in. He watched someone be skinned alive as a child, okay? And even though Ivan lived in the palace, because that was his home, that was his right to own the palace, even though he was the heir to the throne, he wore rags most of the time. He barely had anything that would stay on his body. And he was only given food if he begged for it. He had to beg for them to feed him. Even though he was going to be the heir to the throne, which I think these Boyars forgot about. Which, let's get into this. What happens? So, the Boyars would actually pretend to care about the young Grand Prince, but only when foreign dignitaries came in. So they would dress him up and parade him around as if it was some kind of entertainment, and then throw him back into his rags with no food or little food. So it's no wonder that as a small child, Ivan actually had a reputation for torturing small animals. And by the age of 12, he was torturing cats. It said that he liked to take them up to tall towers and just throw cats or dogs off the tower to see what would happen. So, he was watching these Boyars commit horrible, horrible acts on other humans and then acting them out on animals. He also suffered his whole life with a progressive bone disease that actually would slowly shrink his spine, and it was excruciatingly painful. And he would often use mercury to kind of help ease the pain. But do you know what else mercury does to the body? Do you know? It affects the brain pretty severely and can make people act kind of crazy. So it's no wonder he grew up to be paranoid and ruthless between, taking mercury, which is poison, and growing up in an environment that was just brutal and ruthless. That's all he knew was brutality and mistrust. And he would grow up to be, shockingly, like we've talked about, many of these people, to be very paranoid. So if the Boyars thought that they could scare Ivan into just following them or doing whatever, and he would eventually give up the throne and just let them take over, they very much so underestimated him. And did they underestimate him? Even as a young teen, he was plotting revenge on his childhood captors because he knew what had happened to his mother. He knew that these men were not going to have power over him forever. So on December 29th, 1543, a group of guards actually marched into the home of one of the cruelest of the Boyars, one of the Boyars that treated Ivan the worst, and actually arrested him. When he demanded to know what was going on, the guards' response was that they were just following the orders of the Grand Prince. And after they arrested the man, they dragged him away and fed him alive to a pack of wild dogs. because I guess those were a thing back then. Can you imagine how terrifying is that? Hordes of wild dogs that tore this man to shreds. And this act, was basically going up to the biggest bully in your high school and, punching them in the face and saying, "Come at me, bro." It took some real cojones to pull this kind of thing. He literally was showing the Boyers, I'm not afraid of you, and if you mess with me, you're messing with the wrong person. Oh, and did I mention at this point in time he was only 13 years old? I think I forgot to mention that. He was 13 when he ordered the murder of this person. Yeah, 13. So that was his clear message to the Boyers that they were no longer in charge of him and that they did not get to push him around. And oh, did they get the message. They were tuned in pretty quick after that happened. So when he was 14 years old, he was actually wandering around the streets with his friends and, just having a jolly good old time and beating and robbing any citizen that just happened to cross their path. And this is while he's just a teen. And it gets worse. Just wait. So, ironically, while he was starting to make cruelty to people and, being horrible to just his fellow man, he actually developed another hobby, which happened to be religion, ironically. You would think if you became religious, you'd start seeing everyone around you in a better light and not want to hurt people. Apparently not Ivan. It was like he lived two separate lives. He was very, very devoutly religious. And he actually, so while he was committing his murder at the age of 13, he became super religious and got a tutor known as Mark Macaris. Macaris? Now, this religious leader actually convinced Ivan that Muscovy should be the heart and soul of Orthodox Christianity. And Ivan agreed and started making plans to make that happen. So in 1547, Ivan's regency finally ended. He could finally take his full power and become the leader of Muscovy. And on January 16th, 1547, he was crowned Tsar Ivan IV of all Russians in a very lavish ceremony with Mercurius, his religious tutor, overseeing everything. And mind you, he was the first Tsar of Russia. And I don't know if you've ever wondered where the term Tsar came from, but it's a breakdown of the word emperor from Rome. They believed that they were going to be the next Rome, so the third Rome. So it was like Caesar, Czar of Russia. That's where they got it, is from the Emperor Caesar Augustus. Caesar, Czar of Russia. There you go. Fun fact. So he was the first Tsar. And like I said, they used that term on purpose because it also showed that they were calling back to the old Byzantine Empire and basically saying that they were the rightful leader and defender of the Christian faith. And like I said, they even called themselves the Third Rome. And genuine question for everyone. Why is everyone wanting to be the next Rome? Like, Ivan the Terrible wanted to be the next Rome. Germany, Adolf Hitler wanted to be the next Rome. Why? They all know that Rome fell, right? I'm just curious. Maybe someone can explain that to me. I don't understand. Anyways, sidebar over. Back to our story. About a month later, on February 3rd, 1547, another very important ceremony would take place. Ivan would marry a young girl named, and you might recognize this name, Anastasia Romanova. or more commonly pronounced Romanov. Anastasia Romanov. And no, it's not that Anastasia. We are in 1547. The other Anastasia didn't come around till 1901. Come on, guys. But that is Anastasia's relative. So, long story short, her grandchildren will eventually be in charge of Russia. So, back to our story. But I do want to tell you the super romantic way in which Ivan and Anastasia met. Like all of our stories, it's so romantic that you'll all be so jealous. But what happened was Ivan demanded that all the young ladies be lined up in front of him so he could choose which one he wanted to marry. So romantic, right? He chose Anastasia. But I will say, they actually had a very loving relationship and were actually madly in love with each other. So it actually turned out really well for her and him. So it was a good relationship. And it was often said that she was the only thing actually holding him in check with her kind and loving nature. So her nature really balanced out Ivan and kind of calmed him down. So he was not as terrible. So once Ivan finally took power, he actually started sending out reforms, mostly reforms that centered around accountability. So basically, he was telling the aristocrats, hey, guys, just a heads up, you no longer can just go around and kill commoners just because you feel like it. That's a big no-no now, so if you could stop doing that, that would be great because you won't get away with it anymore. Now, to be very clear, these laws didn't apply to him. He could go and do whatever he wants. It just applied to the boyars, the aristocrats. And that was the reason why he actually enforced those kinds of rules, was to weaken their power. For example, this is an example of how the rules apply to thee but not to me kind of thing. At one point, 70 commoners came to Ivan to complain about a local official, and just hey man, can you help us out? This guy is the worst. And in response, what Ivan did was he had them all stripped naked in the snow and then had their beards set on fire while they stood out in the snow and cold. He didn't have them killed. He just, burnt their beards off, which could also include some face, that kind of thing. So, rules for thee, but not for me, kind of thing. By his 5th year being in office as Tsar, he was actually in a pretty good place. He had the public's approval, probably because they were terrified of him, but that's beside the point. He actually had consolidated power and weakened the hated boyars, so he had taken power away from them as well. And it was still his dream to eventually become the third Rome. Again, I don't understand the obsession with that, but whatever. So what would have been the best way to accomplish that goal, you might ask? Apparently, the best way to do that is to start a crusade. Who knew? So, Ivan starts a crusade, and remember all those nations surrounding Muscovy? Well, it's time to revisit those neighbors at this point in our story. One of them was called the Tartars, and the Tartars were actually starting to build up their army and push in towards the borders of Muscovy. Well, Ivan's troops were not strong enough to take them on for now, so they just kind of ignored them and pushed them off to the side and just pretended like nothing was happening there. But there was an area that Ivan set his sights on because he knew he could conquer that part of the world, and it was called Kazan. It was a much smaller country, and it was much closer to home than the Tartars. So, because he knew they weren't very strong, he decided that's who he wanted to take on, but they weren't weak enough that anyone else from Muscovy before him as the leader had been able to conquer it. So they were strong enough that they had been able to hold off the Muscovy armies before, but Ivan wanted a crack at it, so he wanted to show everybody what was up. On June 16th, 1553, Ivan actually rode in front of his army, which is commendable. He led the army and would actually set aside hours and hours so he could sit and pray to God to have help crushing the, quote, Muslim infidels. And his prayers must have worked because on September 2nd, he laid siege to the Kazan and cut them off from water and other vital supplies, and he just easily overtook the Kazan territory, and it fell on October 13th. So, fun side note, this was just 2 days after Ivan's first son, Dmitri, was born. So, happy birthday to his son. He conquered a new state for him. So, I want to point out that if Ivan had actually died at this point in his life, he would have been remembered very differently in history. Like, we actually probably, as historians, would look at him as more of a potential great ruler who could have become a legend in history versus the horrible, awful person that he is. And in fact, he did almost die in 1553 when he became deathly ill. And he even thought it was then because he actually summoned the boyars, just like his father had, to declare their loyalty to his son Dmitri. But this time, the boyars were not having any of it. They refused, and they actually wanted to swear loyalty to Ivan's cousin to take power. And if Ivan was actually dying, he would have had to accept this decision from the boyars and just accept that his royal line was ending. Unfortunately for the boyars, though, he didn't die, and he recovered, and something had changed in him, and it was super noticeable. Now, stop me if you've heard this one before. You have. He began to be extra paranoid. Like, he was paranoid before his illness, but now that he had recovered from his illness and had seen that the boyars were genuinely against him, it rocked his world, and he had a new level of paranoia when he came out of this illness. And the boyars had just confirmed everything that he had been afraid of. So he was determined to hit at the boyars before they could hit at him, now that he was recovered. So in 1557, Ivan was looking for ways to expand Russia's borders. They had gained enough ground now that they had access to the Caspian Sea, but that was not enough for him. He really wanted access to an ocean. So he decided he needed access to the Baltic Sea, because that could lead to the ocean. And Livonia was the country that stood in the way of Ivan reaching his dream of getting to the ocean. So the Muscovy army, to put it nicely, steamrolled over the army for Livonia? I can't even say it, guys. Sorry. So Ivan's campaign went well, you could say. He just destroyed them. And by 1560, their Grand Master had actually been brought to Moscow and executed. But don't worry, just because they steamrolled them and executed their leader, that does not mean the war is over. So it turned out that it wasn't as easy of a win for Ivan as he thought it was going to be. So because in 1561, they had actually already appointed a new Grand Master in Livonia. And this Grand Master actually did surrender, but not to Russia and not to Ivan. This was like a checkmate that this guy played, because he surrendered to the other of Ivan's neighbors, Poland, Lithuania. Remember their enemy, Poland, Lithuania, aka I'm just going to call them Poland. So Russia had zero claim on the territory. Even though they steamrolled through it, they had no claim because they had surrendered to Poland. And now Ivan was involved in a war with Poland-Lithuania that would last for the next 20 years because of this. Now, this was really horrible timing for Ivan, especially in his personal life, because his personal life just took a turn for the worst. His son, Dmitri, had just died. So, first son, dead. Which, by the way, he had 2 other sons. So, his 2 sons that were left were Ivan the Younger and Fyodor the First, who was actually mentally challenged. So, he wasn't really fit to lead the country. So, everything rested on Ivan the Younger now that the oldest, Dmitri, had passed away. Now, in addition to his son passing away, his wife, Anastasia, had been assassinated, and he loved his wife, guys. Like, loved his wife, and was devastated with the loss of both his son and his wife at the same time. So, this man was already very bitter and brutal, and it got worse after this. And just as a side note, he did end up getting married, they think at least 7 more times, which was a little risky business. For that time period, they thought it was a little shameful, but he didn't care. But he never was able to find someone that he loved as much as Anastasia. He kept looking for that happiness, and it just never worked with any of the other women. He just was never happy. So, side note there, but after he had lost his wife and his son, very soon after that, he actually lost his mentor, his religious leader, Metropolitan Marcus. He passed away in 1563, and Ivan finally was broken. Mentally, he finally broke. And that same year that he lost his mentor, he beat one of his soldiers to death. And that was the first time a Tsar had ever committed murder with his own hands. Obviously, he had other people do his murdering for him, but that was the first time he'd ever killed anyone with his own hands. So it was what happened on April 30th, 1564, that truly was the events that made Ivan into Ivan the Terrible. So he's lost everything. His brain is finally breaking. But on April 30th, it just, okay, hold on. So on that day, his biggest general actually defected to Lithuania. He was shocked and thought that the boyars were trying to make a fool out of him. So he announced that he would be I can't talk. Sorry, guys, it's late. Abdicating the throne. He told the boyars, like, I'm done. That's it. Now, you would think at this moment that the boyars would be super excited because this is what they'd been wanting, right? Like, they wanted his throne. Well, right now would be the worst time for that to happen since they were in the middle of this long, brutal war. If the Tsar left now, the power vacuum that would be left behind would implode all of Russia. So this left the boyars literally one option, and that was to beg Ivan to come back to the throne. And so he agreed in 1565 that he would come back, but it was under one condition. His condition was that he would have a section of Russia all to himself, that he would have no interference by the boyars. He would have all the power, and out of desperation, the boyars agreed to this. Now, this is where things start to get so much worse. And if you thought he was bad before, just hold on. It just gets so bad from this point moving forward. So, now that he had his own mini state within Russia to do whatever he pleased, he would do whatever he pleased. And the boyars would soon really regret the decision they made to give him territories. So, at this point, Ivan divided his nation into 2 parts. And I'm going to butcher these names, and we all know that that's something that I do, so we don't judge. So he divided into the Zemchina, where nothing actually changed. All the rules stayed the same. The boyars still had power. And then there was the Opchina. Guys, you wouldn't believe this, but I'm looking at my notes and I do have pronunciations that I put in here. They're not helpful. It doesn't help. It's just always going to be bad. Anyways, so in the Oprachina, where Ivan would rule, he created the rules and ruled like a ruthless, uncaring god. He had all the power. So Ivan actually got to choose which part of Muscovy fell into this territory. And so it wasn't just like, okay, I'm going to draw a line on a map, like draw this circle right here and that's your territory. No, it was random parts. And it was usually the richest towns that he selected. And because the territories weren't always right next to each other and the lines weren't super clear, they were super fuzzy. And so the line in between the part that he kept the rules the same and the part where he just dominated the people, those lines got very blurry and very unclear a lot of the times. So he basically had way more power than they thought that they were giving him. So to keep all these territories in line, Ivan created Russia's first secret police called the Opshniki. I think. Now, the poor Russian citizens, I really genuinely, my heart goes out to them because they have had to deal with so many secret police, like KGB much, right? So the I even practiced saying this before this. Opshniki, there we go, consisted of over 6,000 men. They were also called the Children of Darkness. The Opshniki would dress all in black. They would drive black carriages and ride black horses to instill fear wherever they went. And the people were right to fear them. They could rob, rape, torture, and kill whoever they wanted and whenever they wanted because they were actually above the law. And they would even go and just burn down buildings just because, yeah, why not? We're bored. Might as well. Their whole job was to scare the people into submission. And oh boy, did it work. They did their job real well. And I won't go into a ton of details about what they did to the populace to make them so scared, because there's a lot I really don't want to traumatize anyone because I don't want to go there. And plus, there's so many things that could fill up a whole episode in and of itself. But I'll give you a small taste of some of the awful things that Ivan's men did to his people. But quick side note, I thought it was actually kind of hilarious. These men often were seen carrying around brooms as they rode on the back of their horses, their black horses. And it was supposed to symbolize the fact that they could sweep anyone away. I just found that so cheesy and so ridiculous. I know these men are terrifying when I tell you what they did. It's horrifying and I would have been super scared, but just to see them carrying around a broom because they're like, we can sweep you away. I don't know. It just came across as cheesy and dumb when I heard that. Anyways, so in their headquarters, they actually would torture to death a minimum of 20 people a day. Yeah, and the kind of torture that Ivan liked to use at this headquarters were specifically kinds of tortures that he found in the Bible. You know, in like the hell scenes. That's the kind of torture that he liked to use. He even at one point would remove people's ribs with red hot pincers. And anyone who missed church in these headquarters was punished with prison time. So he was pretty ruthless, and being a cruel leader, Ivan often attracted ruthless followers. One of his commanders, I won't even try and say his name, I will spare you, liked to round up married women from around Moscow, especially women of higher standing, and have them all raped for his entertainment. And many of them would become pregnant, ruining their succession lines. So he purposely did these things, and it was awful how they treated women. And they were specifically told by Ivan to target the Boyar families, and they would kill them and seize their property and even make them flee into exile. So he was punishing the Boyars with this secret police. And by the end of the 1560s, they had turned so many of the rich families into refugees that they had actually basically replaced all the rich families and aristocracy with the Opshniki. I think say it. I'm just going to keep trying. In 1570, Ivan became convinced that the city of Novgorod was going to rebel against him. It's one of his territories that he had control over, and he was convinced they were going to join Lithuania. Well, he couldn't have that, could he? You know, he can't have anyone abandoning ship on him. By the way, all of this was made up in his paranoid brain. So much so, he actually had his evil little rapey general forge documents to prove that this alliance was happening. So on January 2nd, Ivan led a large part of his Opshniki army to squash the rebellion. And oh boy, did they squash the fake rebellion. For a month, the Opshniki were allowed to basically use the city of Novgorod as a playground where they could kill, burn, maim, and act out any horrible act of violence they wanted to on the people. Many citizens were actually tied into a bag and thrown into the ice-covered river. And if they were lucky enough to be able to make it back out, if they could get their head out and breathe, there was someone waiting there with an axe to, finish the job. And they were also hanging people by the hundreds. Now, on February 12th, 1570, when the Opshniki finally left Novgorod, the city was basically no more. They had burned everything down, and they believed that the death toll from this incident alone was between 6,000 to 12,000 people. And of course, Ivan also used this as an excuse when he went back home to say that some of the Boyars were conspirators with the Novgorod people, and he had them executed. So, yeah. Any excuse to kill anyone, right? So the people of Muscovy at this point were terrified and felt like they were trapped in a never-ending nightmare. The Opshniki came to an end very quickly, though, because remember the Tartars? I love saying their name. It's the Tartars, but I like saying it Tartar because it's more fun. So the Crimean Tatar force of 120,000 soldiers was marching towards Moscow, but Ivan actually brushed this off and didn't think much of it because his Opshniki spies had told him it was just a couple thousand, we can handle it. Well, they were wrong. It was 120,000 soldiers, and once Ivan realized that, it was too late. He couldn't fortify his city anymore. He didn't have the time, and being the amazing leader he was, once he got word that this was actually going to happen and they were coming to attack the city, being the awesome leader, he gathered all the treasure he could possibly find and he fled, leaving Moscow to its fate. Now, the Tartars destroyed the city and forced people into slavery. Children were slaughtered in their homes, and the Kremlin was literally the only building left standing. They burned everything else to the ground. And when the Tartars finally retreated, over 160,000 Muscovites were dead or taken away to be slaves. And it said there were so many bodies left in the river that the river actually had to change course. It changed course because it couldn't get around all the bodies. Like, how upsetting is that? And so Ivan comes back and he's just like, oh man, what happened here? Well, I guess it's the Opshniki's fault. He blamed the Opshniki for failing to protect Moscow, and he set his destructive sights on them. He wanted them to pay in blood for all the blood that was lost. So look at that. You were his friends for a little bit, and now you're his deepest enemy. So it was a little too late when he made all of these changes because their economy was destroyed. Their cities and people were devastated by war. And the people were exhausted with everything that they'd been through. Like, if you think you're having a bad life, take a look at this. I would not want to live in this era. It sounds so horrible. I can't imagine. It just sounds awful. Anyways, by the way, I forgot to mention that at this point in history, Russia is still at war in the Baltics, trying to keep that access to the ocean. So Ivan refused to end that war, even though that was the best thing he could have done. He refused because he wanted access to the ocean, so he wouldn't stop. But in the early 1570s, Ivan tried to take back control by instituting a new reign of terror, where he would actually have his opponents at home roasted alive. But he didn't understand that his biggest enemy at this point was actually himself and his intense paranoia, because he was still going after the boyars, but he should have been backing out of the war. He didn't notice that while he was attacking the boyars, Poland and Sweden were both invading Russia. But Ivan wouldn't listen to anyone because he was spiraling out of control. His paranoia and just, what is the word I'm looking for? Viciousness was just out of control. And he took no accountability for Russia's crumbling state. He didn't think it was his fault. He blamed the boyars, which, if you think about his childhood and his life as is, it makes sense he would blame the boyars. But also, he wasn't living in reality because it was his fault. So his son Ivan the Younger, because remember, he still has two sons, was actually doing a lot better than his father was. He was a very strong general. People really liked him. So much so that the boyars even wrote to Ivan asking him if he could maybe just, take over leading. Now, Ivan assumed by leading, they all meant leading the country. What they meant is, can he take over leading the armies? But, as you could guess, Ivan did not take this well, especially since he thought they were trying to replace him as the leader of the country. So, with his paranoia out of control, Ivan did not take this well, and in November of 1581, seething with anger, he actually stumbled upon his son's pregnant wife and attacked. He beat her so severely. Now, I need to mention that Ivan the Younger and his wife had been trying to have children for years. They were trying to produce an heir for years, and they finally were able to get pregnant. And Ivan the Terrible attacks his daughter-in-law and beats her so severely that she actually miscarried and lost her child, killing the heir to his throne. Oh, and don't worry, this story gets worse. His son notices that he is beating on his son's wife. And so his son comes over to try and save his wife from the wrath of his father. And his father just turns the wrath on his son and beats him so severely with his staff that his head actually caved in. And he cried, "What have I done?" He was in shock and couldn't believe that he had just murdered his own son. So on November 19th, 1581, Ivan killed Ivan the Younger, his heir to the throne. And not to mention, not only did he kill his heir to the throne, but he killed his son's heir to the throne. So the only son he had left, he had lost Dmitri, his oldest son, his favorite wife, Anastasia, and now Ivan the Younger and his only grandchild were all now dead, and he had killed the last two himself. Now, the only heir that remained was Ivan's last son, Fyodor, who was believed to have mental challenges. And in case you're wondering, yes, his ascension to the throne was disastrous. Oh, and the country suffered. But Ivan's bloodline actually ended with his son, Fyodor, because Fyodor did not produce an heir. Anyways, so the death of Ivan the Younger seemed to finally wake Ivan the Terrible up from his crazed state and violent state that he'd been in for years. He snapped back to reality, and the weight of all the atrocities that he had committed came crashing down on him. He began to pray for each and every one of his victims by name that he had killed or had killed, and asked for forgiveness for the sins that he had committed against these people. And in 1581, he formally asked the Pope to negotiate an end to the war with Poland. Finally, he was ready to end the war, and eventually Russia surrendered all their gains back to Poland, so they no longer had access to the ocean. And they would also make peace with Sweden and give up all their access to the coast. So they lost all access. And after the death of hundreds of thousands of people and 24 years of war, Russia finally had peace and was back to their humble state where they began in 1558. So they had gained no ground. So basically all the death and torture and suffering was for nothing. So Ivan put them through that for nothing. By 1584, Ivan became extremely ill, and it was too much for him to even leave his bed. The only joy in life that he found at this point was playing chess, and that's actually how he died. On March 18th, 1584, he had a stroke while playing chess and died. Some people think that he might have actually just been strangled to death by the boyars because they'd had enough of him. But I like the chess story much better, so we're just going to say he died while playing chess because that's a great way to go. So it is interesting to me looking at his life, looking at Ivan's life, that it took the death of his son to actually realize that his religion, like, what was his religion actually about? He spent his whole life murdering and torturing people in the name of religion. But it took till the very end for him to actually realize that he'd messed up and that he had done some really, really horrible, awful things. And if you look at his whole life as a whole, like, it makes sense. He traded brutality for brutality. That's all he really knew. But because of all the deaths, because of all the torturing, because of his secret police who did horrible, heinous things, Ivan the Terrible is our horrible human in history for the week. So be sure you tune in next week. If you liked this episode, be sure you're liking, subscribing, and sharing it with other people. We love talking about these horrible humans. So next week, we will be talking about another American serial killer. And I highly doubt you've heard of this one. This person killed their own children to cash out on their insurance, then killed their spouse for even more money and burned down their house for even more money. Bella Gunness, could be Gunness, is a woman who lived in infamy for her heartless crimes. So tune in next week to hear more about Bella Gunness and her life and her story of evil deeds. Again, make sure you're liking, subscribing, and sharing with everybody that you know, and we will see you guys next week on Horrible Humans in History.